Being selected only entitles you to continue the path to becoming a Green Beret. It's not like other schools where if you make it through Ranger training and you successfully complete all the gates, you get your tab and now you're Ranger qualified. Selection is just the first step. Successfully completing other schools may earn you a badge with some additional skills that are of value to your unit. Just because you may see a soldier with a fancy tab or badge doesn't mean anything. Many soldiers don't wear all their qualifications on their uniform, and that's fine. Some walk around looking like a North Korean general, and that's fine. Welcome back, folks, to Looking Over Strange Terrain. My name is Javier, where I sit around talking about Army stuff. Thank you for tuning in. If you're interested enough in following me on social media, you can follow me on X at Looking Over, Facebook at Javier Mackey, Instagram at Looking Over Strange Terrain. This podcast is posted on Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and Spotify. I know it sounds silly to hear podcast hosts ask you to follow a podcast like or a YouTube channel or post comments and such. But what it does is provide opportunities for engagement with other podcast hosts as well as others, all while fighting amongst yourselves about who is right and who is wrong. All right, so let's get into it. And military science, a force multiplier is a factor or combination of factors that gives personnel or weapons or other hardware the ability to accomplish greater feats than without it. Additional military training multiplies a unit's ability to fix and destroy the enemy by ensuring every individual or specific individuals are trained in skills that are tailored to the mission. So for this episode, we're going to talk about military training and preparation for schools. I wrote this episode to soldiers or others prepared for a specific school they are waiting or wanting to or plan on attending in the future. And I'm going to do this by sharing what this was like for me as a private first class in the 101st Airborne Division Air Assault, in comparison to how to do things and to do it on my own in preparations for the Special Forces assessment and selection on my way to becoming a Green Beret. You may think that upon completion of Army basic training that you know everything there is to know about being a soldier. After meeting the basic requirements to serve our great nation, you may feel like you're ready to race off to foreign lands, taking the fight to those that pose a minor threat to our national security. But in the words of my drill sergeant, take a knee, high speed, and prepare yourself for a ride. So once you report to your unit, you may find yourself with little to do, performing simple tasks until your platoon leadership can square you away. Sometime in 1999, young Private First Class Mackey had processed into Charlie Company, the 501st Signal Battalion at Fort Campbell, Kentucky, assigned to a tactical satellite communications platoon. At that time, the 501st Signal Battalion was a standalone communications support unit that supported 101st Airborne Division. But today, this unit most likely does not exist as a standalone, rather integrated across multiple brigades. There was little for me to do other than learn my place on the platoon, continue to learn more about being a satellite communications soldier, and prepare for air assault and airborne schools. All right, to be honest, I had no clue as to what was going on. I was told to be places at the right time and the correct uniform and ready to train. My hand was held through every step of the way, sprinkle a little bit of micromanagement, and that sums up Army leadership in the late 1990s. I recall back in those days, to be considered a good soldier, required being in the right uniform, which consisted of carrying around a bunch of unnecessary items. Now I'm going to kind of deviate from the topic a bit, but the 101st, you were required to carry the division handbook, dog tags, along with the Army values tag, military identification card, any military licenses, and a few other items the battalion wanted you to carry at any given moment. At any given moment, an NCO can shake you down for those items. And the only items I really took issue with were the division handbook and the Army values tag. Many times I've forgotten that I forgot that book in my pocket and I did laundry and it went through the wash. And every time that happened, my team leader would decide to shake me down to see if I had it on me. It was as if he knew. And on top of all this, you had to be able to sing the division song with great enthusiasm when ordered to do so. Now, I don't want to paint a picture of Army leaders in the 90s spent the day hunting for deficiencies, nor were they worried about a stupid song. It was their way to show they cared. However, having these items ready to be presented at any given time as a lowered enlisted soldier meant you were in the running to attend any additional military training that was available when the opportunity presented itself. And this additional training was important to your rank advancement in the Army. The schools you attend meant points added to your record, and that, when added up, when it's time to be promoted to sergeant, these points made that advancement easier. As a lower enlisted, you had to play the game, as they say. Like I mentioned before, two schools I had to prepare for were Air Assault School and Airborne training. Now, Air Assault was a requirement for any advancement in rank or leadership in the 101st, while serving in the 101st. So being a young PFC I had to play the game. So here is what I learned to be prepared and some observations of my leaders. As a young soldier, when you're getting ready for school, the first thing you're going to do is get a lot of your information as word of mouth from your peers. Most of what I learned about Air Assault School was from my peers within the platoon, and from their point of view, what was good, bad, and what to look out for. A ton of information was shared, and advice was usually taken from the most squared away soldier in the unit. One of the many ways soldiers bond is by telling lies while eating MREs and suffering. Air Assault School was supposed to be the 10 of the hardest days in the Army. The first is the most challenging, and my peers emphasized making sure my gear was serviceable for use as a must. The items needed to appear as new as possible, ready to use throughout training. The day you showed up for training, your equipment was laid out and inspected for serviceability. This emphasized the importance of paying attention to detail, which would be important while inspecting sling loads that will be rigged underneath UH-47 Chinooks. Those who completed the air assault training spent time going over what was necessary in the classroom instruction for the classroom instruction portion, but that was easy. Most people either failed the inspection or the obstacle course, and there was one guy in my class who quit because he thought it was dumb to have to say air assault every time his left foot hit the ground. Yes, even for the simplest task, you were required to say it. Air assault, air assault, air assault every time that foot hit the ground. And you weren't allowed to walk anywhere, so you were doing this at a run or a jog, or what we called it an 80-second air. Not a lot of people know this. When you're in the military, you spend a lot of money getting ready for these schools. Being a baller on a budget is hard. Young soldiers often find themselves in debt because of cars, booze, entertainment, women, and military schools. Yes, soldiers will go into debt getting ready for military training. But why? Should the unit make sure you have all the gear that you need? Can you just borrow from another soldier? Should the school provide the gear that you need? Well, in a perfect world, the answer would be yes. But that all costs money, and it's better to have your own stuff anyway. Like all military schools that you go to, you have to be physically fit to complete the training. All the above, including physical fitness, was a joint effort between myself and my team leader. He taught me everything from tying a Swiss seat for rappelling to rope climbing. But shouldn't this be on the individual soldier to figure out for themselves? Well, let me explain. The Army places major emphasis on developing leaders. From the time you complete basic training to retirement, you are constantly being groomed or grooming others to be leaders. This is done all day, every day, regardless if you know you're doing it or not. This can make life easier in a perfect world or just be playing out painful. But the responsibility of my team leader and the platoon sergeant was to ensure that every member of the platoon met the unit standard of achieving the air assault qualification. The steps these leaders took impacted my future career performance. Earlier when I mentioned leaders hand-holding, I didn't say that to be meant to be taken literally, but as mentoring soldiers through a process, it makes it easier. And mentorship, to me, is a process that helps leaders self-develop by providing lessons learned in their personal journey. And this sometimes involves making mistakes or so that you can avoid problems or by just watching other people's experiences. Looking back on my experience, my team leader failed air assault training 3 times. He never gave up because his team leader never gave up on him. And when it came time to helping me, he had a great deal of information to help me along the process. He eventually earned his air assault badge, which was a huge accomplishment. Meanwhile, he helped me and took time out of his day to make sure I could complete the most difficult parts of the obstacle course and ensure that the equipment on the packing list was serviceable. But at the end of the day, Army leaders sacrifice a great deal of time developing young soldiers, and the payoff is very rewarding. When it was my turn as a leader, I did the same. Now, this episode isn't about air assault school. I'm using it as an example of what I went through as a young PFC in the Army, knowing very little and having little to no leadership experience. This experience taught me confidence in myself, my ability to properly prepare myself for military training, and to trust my leaders and equipment. Having attended some of the schools that I've had did provide opportunities to lead as a young soldier, which was awesome. But let's talk about Airborne School. And I don't have a lot to say about it, to be honest. Airborne School is easy. You show up, you got to be able to run and not be afraid to jump from a high-performance aircraft without injuring yourself at least 5 times. I wish there was more to say about this, but Airborne School is that easy. Well, as my career progressed, I found myself waiting to attend various schools, one of which was the NCO Academy Basic Leaders course. To get into these courses, at the time, NCO Academies had a waiting list for those with the points to attend, and pretty much going through the same experiences as air assault in regards to being physically fit to attend, as well as having a very detailed packing list to ensure that all your equipment was serviceable and ready to train. But back in those days, you can gain promotion points by taking correspondence courses, from awards and achievements, your marksmanship training, and there was other certifications and qualifications. Basically being a show pony at a soldier a month, year, or some other type of military board. Some occupational skills, some military occupational skills had lower points than others. And for those MOSs, it was easy for them to make points to get into those academies. But unlike air assault, the NCO Academy has a few additional hurdles that involves points and promotion boards you had to work through, and like I mentioned earlier, was a bit of a leadership stressor. Not because of my doing, rather how the Army deals with promotions. And thanks to a group of terrorists deciding to fly a couple of passenger planes into the World Trade Towers on September 11, 2001. But by this time, I had gotten married, moved to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and was assigned to the 2nd Signal Battalion. My oldest was already born, and now was 10 months old, attempting to take her first steps, teething and drooling everywhere. During this time in the 2nd, I didn't feel like my career was progressing, and thoughts of getting out of the Army after my first enlistment began to creep into my mind. This had a lot to do with not getting into military schools that would further my career. My platoon sergeant, Sergeant First Class Cooper, had joined the platoon a few months prior to me arriving to Fort Bragg. After having voluntarily dropped out of the Special Forces Medical Sergeant's course due to hardships on his marriage, and was reassigned as the platoon sergeant of my platoon. By this time, I was a specialist promotable, waiting on points or a slot to get into the basic leaders course. If there was a slot available, I initially didn't know about his time in the Special Forces Qualification course or the Q course. And it wasn't until I decided to drop my Special Forces Assessment Selection SF packet that the platoon learned that Sergeant First Class Cooper was very supportive of my decision, and he encouraged me, but added that I was on my own. Nobody was going to hold my hand. All preparations had to be done by me, and I was solely responsible to be prepared to attend SFAS. He shared what he could, what I could experience, what to be prepared for, how to act, etc. The best advice he gave was make sure your wife supports the decision. Having her support would alleviate a lot of stress that will allow me all the necessary energy needed to make it through. So here's a brief history on the Special Forces Assessment and Selection. SFAS was the brainchild of Brigadier General James Guest, who commanded the John F. Kennedy Special Warfare Center and School during the mid-1980s. General Guest devised a 3-week assessment and selection process to ensure a better quality of soldiers were selected for Special Forces. During the 1950s, the Army created special mission units known as Special Forces. Volunteers would undergo difficult training. Selection was not separate from the training course. To professionalize the selection process, General Guest ordered SFAS brought online, and the first class was held on June 12, 1988, a year later. First Special Warfare Training Group was activated with 3 training battalions and 1 support battalion. Honestly, I don't remember much about how I prepared for SFAS. I do remember being at the gym every morning at 05 and then turning around participating in platoon PT at 06:30. If I could, I rucked every day during lunch, and a short run after work was over. I don't remember much going on for unit training at the time due to the attacks. I imagine commands from the President of the United States on down was figuring out what the next step was going to be. But in the meantime, there were a few hundred guys like myself gearing up to try out for any special operations command that would take us. And having a family and watching the 9/11 unfold in real time motivated every action that led to me stepping onto the truck that drove myself and 99 others to Camp McCall, North Carolina, the fall of 2001. There were a few guys that I met that had been to a previous SFAS that had either dropped due to injuries, weren't ready, or were a 21-day non-select. For those who don't know, 21-day non-selects are guys that didn't meet most of the standards and were invited to return at a later date. I mentioned before that going to a military training course, you know what's to be expected. For example, you go to Ranger School and you have to be able to complete a 5-mile run, 36 minutes, that standard before showing up for training and can then train to achieve. You know you're going to do the infamous Ranger obstacle course known as Derby Queen. Pretty much you know when and where all these events will take place. SFAS in 2001, not so much so. The only thing you knew about SFAS was Team Week, and there wasn't anything you could do to prepare yourself for the tortures of those days. Basically, at SFAS, you're told that you're about to go on a release run marked on a marked path and that you will continue running until you're told to stop. There was no walking, and if the SFAS cadre observes you walking, he will simply say, "Candidate, you failed to do what was instructed for this event. Do you wish to continue?" You either quit or you continued. When it came to PT, the two events I wasn't prepared for were log and rifle PT. Between the two, I only had done rifle PT and basic training. There isn't much you can do to prepare yourself for these two events other than develop the resolve and gut it out. Log PT is technically your first team event. And as of June 24th, 2023, Task and Purpose article, here's a quote from a retired Sergeant First Class, Adam Klakowitz. And he said, "The early classes were rough." He went through SFAS in 2005 and remembers the brutal sessions of log PT. That one was effing dudes up, he says. "I saw two guys get hurt in the PT pit with the logs during SFAS. They don't do that anymore, and for good reason, because they determined it's where guys are going to get hurt the most, so they took it out." So when people are like, when I went through, guys were getting broke off left and right, and I'm like, yeah, that's not the effing answer, man. I want to see what you got, but this ain't the way to test it. Log PT is gone, but the Green Berets running SFAS have found better ways to test candidates' mental and physical fortitude. Another aspect of SFAS, of my XFAS experience, I wasn't prepared for the lack of sleep during the first week. When I arrived, there was a layout of all your gear you were supposed to bring on the packing list. You were grouped in alphabetical order by last name during the layout, and you were given a roster number. Then came the height and weight in Army, the APFT, the normal push-up, sit-up, 2-mile run, which was conducted on very, very, very little sleep. The cadre silently counted each correct rep and recorded your run time without you telling you if you passed or failed. This psychologically broke guys. If you failed the APFT, you were given another chance to pass. Only the cadre knew if you did or didn't. After the APFT, if you didn't quit, we took a trip back to Bragg for a swim test. This was a pass-fail event. If you were selected and you failed the swim test, you were given 2 weeks, 2 weeks of training in a Q course and had to be able to pass it then. Next came the sleep in my games. There was no downtime. When you did have some downtime, you could shower, perform maintenance on your gear, and get some rest, but you weren't allowed to sleep. From time to time, the cadre would walk through the barracks and quietly write down your roster number if you were asleep. Outside of the cadre hooch, there was a whiteboard that you had to check every 15 minutes while we were in the barracks awaiting training. This meant this kept you awake even while you were asleep. We needed to have some way to check that whiteboard, so each of the barracks established a 15-minute roster while we were in the barracks, even while we were asleep. What would happen is at random times, the cadre would post a time to be outside with whatever equipment you needed to have, a roster number formation. Sometimes you were marched off to a class to receive instruction. Others, it was accountability formation. Believe it or not, more than one soldier would quit every time this formation was held. I couldn't tell you how many times that formation was held during that week and what our mindsets were during that time period, but it did happen. And because attending SFAS, you volunteer, you're not voluntold. There's nothing keeping you in training. So at any time you can decide Special Forces wasn't for you, and you were free to return to your unit. Those who quit were placed in a holdover hut until there was there were enough people to fill a truck, and then they would bus those guys back. But at the end of the day, you can't train yourself to deal with these type of mind games. If you're going to quit SFAS, the first week is the time this will most likely happen. And imagine waking up in the middle of a 35-minute deep sleep after being awake 48 hours, and to be told you have 5 minutes to be out on formation with an 80-pound rucksack filled with the required packing list. The formation does a right face forward march, and you march to the starting point, to a start point, and told that you will be on a release ruck along a marked path with no time standard. Well, this is something you need to be prepared to do. You needed to be prepared to do in those days. Well, these experiences, I feel, were unique to SFAS at the time. There may be a few other assessments in the selections in the Army that share some of these same aspects, of which I don't have a comment for. But today, SFAS is different from the time I went through. You have some semblance of what's going to happen before your arrival to better prepare you and to keep you from injuring yourself. So if you don't make it through, you can return to your unit functionable and able to serve in your original capacity. Being selected only entitles you to continue the path to becoming a Green Beret. It's not like other schools where if you make it through Ranger training and you successfully complete all the gates, you get your tab, and now you're Ranger qualified. Selection is just the first step. Successfully completing other schools may earn you a badge with some additional skills that are of value to your unit. But to be honest, soldiers attend particular schools just to walk around with a fancy badge or tab on a uniform. This does bother me, and you know the type when you see them. Just because you may see a soldier with a fancy tab or badge doesn't mean anything. Many soldiers don't wear all their qualifications on their uniform, and that's fine. Some walk around looking like a North Korean general, and that's fine as well. Regardless, if you're wearing them or not, make sure you're imparting the knowledge associated with the qualifications that you hold. Your professionalism, competency, and respect for others will inspire those in your sphere of influence to aspire to be like you, and like you, bring value to your unit. Well, hey, thanks for listening. This has been a great time to reflect on my experiences, and I hope that I helped you helped you out with your path going forward in the military. I provided links to the task and purpose article in the show notes, as well as the SF recruiters links and SFAS physical fitness training handbook. Until next time, thanks for listening. Dale Presley Bear.